Hi, I'm Jenny Miller of Let's Get Sewing. Are you ready to take the fear and frustration out of your sewing experience and finally get sewing? Then you're in the right place. Be sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any of my tips and tutorials. And check out the caption too. There's a link to my website where you can find out more about my course, Conquer Your Sewing Machine, and future courses that I have coming. And now, let's get sewing. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about sergers, specifically the differences between sergers and sewing machines. So, if you have been staring at your serger, wondering if it is secretly judging you, you're not alone. Let's dive into this topic. So, we're going to take a deep dive into those differences between your sewing machine and your serger, talk about what each one is best at, and why understanding them and how they work together is going to take your sewing to the next level. So this video is really aimed at beginners, people who just got a serger and aren't sure what to do with it, or people who are wondering if they even need a serger. So let's dive into the basic function comparison of the two machines, and then I'll show you some examples of both. But when you're sewing with a sewing machine, you have your needle thread and your bobbin thread. The two come together and form what's called a lock stitch when they loop together, and then they go to the next stitch and loop together again. So basically, that lock stitch is formed by the threads stretched along the fabric and just locking at each stitch. So there's no stretch to that seam at all. And in fact, you may in the past have experienced seams popping when you stretched the fabric too far or tried to get into your garment because there is no stretch to it, it's just formed by a lock stitch. Now, most sewing machines can also sew a zigzag stitch, which is a lock stitch that kind of goes back and forth side to side as it goes down along the seam. A zigzag stitch does have some stretch to it because of the way the stitch goes from side to side. So you can use a zigzag stitch to sew knit fabrics and seams that need to have stretch to them. You can also use a zigzag stitch to prevent fraying on the edge of your fabric and finish off seams, which I'll show you a little bit later in this video as well. But you don't have to have a serger to do that. A zigzag stitch can do it as well. Now your serger uses anywhere from 2 threads to 5 threads, depending on your serger and the stitch you're doing. For our purposes, we're going to talk about the 3 and 4 thread functions today. And I don't have a serger that does 5 threads. Those are a little bit more specialized serger. We're just talking about basic sergers that use between 2 and 4 threads today. Your serger creates a serged or overlock stitch, and that stitch goes all the way around the edge of the fabric and locks along the edge of the fabric, which I'll point out to you in just a bit as well. But the difference is the serger has 2 loopers that instead of the needles coming down and locking in place with just one bobbin thread, the needles come down and lock with an upper looper and a lower looper that create those stitches that go out along the edge. And because those looper threads go perpendicular to the edge of the fabric, that's why you get the stretch in a serged seam. So again, I'm going to show you images of this in a minute. I'm just doing a brief overview of the different functions of the machine. Another thing that a serger does that your sewing machine does not do is it trims the fabric as you are sewing. So if you have a 5/8 inch seam allowance, your needles would line up with where that seam needs to be, and the serger cuts off any extra fabric beyond what it needs to create the stitch. So it trims that edge, and that makes a much cleaner, nicer edge than maybe a zigzag when you're finishing the edge of a stitch. But again, the zigzag does the trick just as well. So it's much cleaner and faster at finishing the edge of your fabric. It's just that that's a bonus and not necessarily something that you have to have in your project. So let's take a look now at the two machines side by side and see what each one does differently. For our purposes in this video, I'm using this piece of rib knit so that we can illustrate the stretch between the different stitches. So I have my machine set to just a straight stitch, and I'm just going to sew a line of stitching, and you'll see the needle goes down, it hooks with the bobbin thread, and then goes straight to the next stitch. So when I remove my fabric or my seam from the machine, I have that line of stitching and it does not stretch. The fabric stretches, but the stitches do not stretch. And so that's why it's called a lock stitch. So now let's look at a zigzag stitch, and you'll see that the needle is going to go back and forth as we go along. Each time it will lock with the bobbin thread, but because of the zigzag nature, we're going to end up with a little bit of stretch. And so when I remove that from the machine, my zigzag has a lot more stretch to it than my straight stitch. So that's why the zigzag stitch can be an option for sewing on knit fabrics. Okay, here we have our serger, and I'm sorry it's a little dusty on the inside. I did vacuum it out the other day, but it's almost impossible to keep sergers completely clean. But I want to show you a little bit of the inner workings inside the machine. So I'm hoping this is going to show up. I'm going to turn the hand wheel, and when I do, I want you to watch this top bar here and this bar right down here. So this top one and this bottom one, and watch what they do when I turn the hand wheel. They move back and forth perpendicular to the edge of the fabric. And those are the loopers that I was talking about in the opening. So now I've closed up my serger. It'll be hard to see the loopers working back there, but I want you to watch what happens. I've got a new piece of my rib knit with plenty of stretch. And you'll see here that it created this serged edge. Okay, so here is my serged edge of the fabric, and you'll see that those loopers are perpendicular to the edge of the fabric. If I turn it to the back of the fabric, you'll see something very similar. Those loopers that interacted or locked with the needle threads, but did not form a lock stitch because there is still plenty of stretch in this rib knit fabric. So now let's talk about the blade. Hidden in here, very hard to see, is a blade that is going to go up and down and trim the edge of the fabric. Now, I did not trim any off in that first part because I just wanted to show you this stitch. But watch now what happens if I move my fabric over a little bit. You can see that this was trimmed off of the edge of the fabric, and it still formed the same stitch with plenty of stretch. So those overlocking threads that allow it to stretch and the blade are probably the biggest difference between a serger and a sewing machine. Now that we've seen both of the machines in action, let's talk about what each one is best for. The sewing machine is best for most garment construction. In fact, you can do any garment construction or all garment construction on your sewing machine, but it works best on very detailed things like darts tend to be easier on your sewing machine. Of course, top stitching you can't do on a serger, so you would need a sewing machine for that. Also, your hems. I have not ever been able to get a really good hem on my serger. There are techniques that they say to use to do a blind hem, but I'm much happier with a blind hem on my sewing machine than I am with one on my serger. Also, you can't do buttonholes on a serger, so that's something that you would have to have a sewing machine for. But let's talk about the serger. Your serger is really good for sewing knits. So maybe you noticed that the scrap that I was showing you the stitches on matched this t-shirt. That is because I just recently made this t-shirt and I did the entire thing on my serger until I got to the hems. And the hems I did with a sewing machine and a double needle. I use a special technique of serging the edge and using that double needle to get a nice professional looking hem. Looks like it was done with a cover stitch machine, but with the combination of the two, you don't need a fancy cover stitch machine for that particular effect. A serger is also much faster than a sewing machine when it comes to finishing those edges because it cuts and binds the edge at the same time. Whereas if you use a zigzag stitch, then you often have to go back and trim some areas yourself or trim off threads that still tend to fray until you've hit that zigzag stitch. So the serger is just faster and easier for finishing seam edges. Here's a quick little clip of how I use the serger to finish my seam edges before I even start assembling my project. Here you can see this is a sleeve piece on top, and I have serged around the edges while it is flat before I even start sewing. And finally, there are a few different effects, decorative effects, that you can get with a serger that you can't get with a sewing machine. Here are a few of those that I like to use when I'm sewing. You can do gathers on your serger without the sewing machine at all. You can make this fun rolled hem or lettuce effect on your serger. And you can make this cover stitch hack with your serger and your sewing machine together. Now let's talk about just a few common misunderstandings that people have when they're looking for a serger or purchasing a serger. One common thing is that a lot of people think they can replace their sewing machine with their serger. But as we've seen today, there are certain things that only the sewing machine can do or only the serger can do. The two really work together in tandem best. Another common misconception is that you have to have a serger to sew knits, and you think that you can't sew them on your sewing machine. You definitely can. You just need to make some adjustments on your sewing machine to get a good effect on your finished knit garment. Another common problem or misunderstanding that people have when they get a serger is that they buy it to level up their sewing game, to get a more professional look, a cleaner look to their finished garments. And then they get it home and they have no idea what to do with it. There are a lot of moving parts in a serger. We looked at some of those today. So you really need to have some training in the parts of your serger, how it works, how to thread it, how to troubleshoot the tension. They're all very different from a sewing machine. So when you get a serger, make sure you get some good training to learn how to use it properly, because it really is a versatile and wonderful machine. So if you got a serger and you're still intimidated by it, I've got you. Don't worry about it. I have a course called Conquer Your Serger. It takes you from what the parts of the serger are all the way through to those decorative finishing techniques. And so if you have one and it's sitting there and you're not using it, you're going to want to get into that course. Doors don't open for another week and a half or so, but you can get on the wait list now, and I will put that link in the description for this video so that you will be notified as soon as doors to the course open, and you can finally start pulling that serger out and using it the way it was intended and for all of the many things that it was intended for. We're going to cover threading, tension issues, differential feed, and what that means. We didn't even talk about that today. I'm going to show you decorative techniques like gathers and a rolled hem and a special, besides this hem hack, another hack that gives you the look of a cover stitch machine. So we're covering everything in Conquer Your Sewing Machine. So give this video some love, subscribe to my channel, and drop in the comments. Do you have a serger? Do you love to use your serger? Are you confused by your serger? Let me know. I would love to hear it, and I will reply to as many of those comments as I can. Thank you for joining me today. My goal is to take the frustration out of your sewing experience, and so I hope my tips are helpful. Feel free to comment with any questions or ideas you may have. I will try to get back to you as soon as I can. Now, let's get sewing.